Good afternoon. I'm Michael Lind, the Policy Director of the Economic Growth Program, and welcome to our conversation with David Callahan, a Senior Fellow at Demos, the think tank that he co-founded, and we should have a copy of your book, but maybe you don't need it. The author of I'm sorry, I need the copy of the book. I don't want to screw up your subtitle. Fortunes Have Changed, The Rise of the Liberal Rich in the Remaking of America. I would have gotten it all except for the Remaking of America. David started this book, I think, before the crash, right? And, since then, the liberal rich, at least some of them have gotten somewhat less rich, while being still liberal and still rich. So we decided, in conversation with David, that rather than do the usual book talk, where the author simply gives a précis of the book and then takes questions in a very limited amount of time, we would have more of a conversation. So I'll start this out with a question or two for David, and then we'll turn to those of you in the audience to take part. So this is more of a conversation than a lecture. And I guess my first question is, without giving the usual book talk, what did you learn in the course of writing the book? That is, how was your perception when you got the contract different from what it is today?
Okay, well, I signed the contract to write this book in early 2007. It was kind of at the apex of the boom, and I was generally interested in the rich. I had, in my previous two books, looked at the sort of power of the upper class. My book, The Cheating Culture, had focused very much on their bad behavior among the upper class, looking at the scandals on Wall Street, the frauds at places like Enron and WorldCom, and I'd become very interested in the kind of culture and norms of the wealthy. So I signed a book contract with a very kind of hazy idea of what I would be writing about, and proceeded to flop around doing a lot of general research for about a year, and I realized I didn't really have an idea for the book, and I thought, oh, this is horrible. Maybe I should just pay back the advance. And my wife and I had some conversations. Well, could we afford to pay back the advance? It doesn't happen very often in the publishing world, but there's a lot of anxiety around that. And then in January 2008, Bill Gates gave a speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos, in which he proclaimed that capitalism had failed to improve the lives of the poorest people in the world, and critiqued capitalism in terms you seldom hear from people like him, and called for a new kind of creative capitalism. That got my attention. Shortly after, Lee Scott, the head of the CEO of Walmart, came out during the same month with this sort of sweeping proclamation about how Walmart was going to embrace environmental sustainability. And that got my attention. And so I started thinking, is something happening among the business elite? As a student of history, I knew that kind of in the corporate world, there tends to be these cycles where there are periods of greed and excess, followed by more humane periods in terms of the norms that prevail in the corporate world. And I wondered whether the pendulum was finally swinging, and whether the corporate world was starting to move in a more progressive direction. And that got me thinking more broadly about some other trends I'd noticed. A huge amount of money that had gone into the Democrats' campaign in 2004 through 527 groups by George Soros, Peter Lewis, the establishment of the Center for American Progress, largely with the money of Herb and Marion Sandler, as well as a couple other billionaires, the creation of the Democracy Alliance. I was sort of aware of all these things that had been happening, but I had never really sort of stopped to kind of put together the dots. And so that thinking finally gave me, a year after signing the book contract, an actual idea for the book, which was to look at liberalism in the upper class. And as I set out to do that, I decided to really kind of go broad, that I would look not just at what was happening in the corporate world, not just the campaign money, but also at the demographic shifts and what was happening in a lot of affluent areas in terms of the shift from Republican affluent suburbs to more Democratic-leaning suburbs, and as well I would look at some of the institutions where young, wealthy people are being educated. The private schools in particular. I have a whole chapter on private schools. So I set off to do this work and came up with along the way an even more specific kind of hypothesis and angle, which is what was happening is that the rise of the knowledge economy and the shift away from a manufacturing economy was dramatically changing the sort of demographic makeup of the upper class. And in particular, in a knowledge economy, you have people who succeed in large part because they are highly educated. Almost by definition, you need to have pretty strong cognitive skills in education to succeed in a knowledge economy. And that the people getting rich were increasingly drawn from the ranks of the sort of highly educated, sort of post-grad parts of the demographic strata, and that a lot of these people had grown up in blue state America. They were raised in professional households, deep, in blue metro areas on the East Coast or the West Coast, and had many of the traits that might lead them to you might expect them to be liberal. So I very much focused in on that demographic shift and the shift in the economy that produced that change in the upper class. And happy to say more about it, but maybe it's a good idea to have another question.
Well, I just want to follow up before opening this up to everybody else. How much is there continuity of attitudes, even if there's discontinuity of partisanship? If you look at the Northeastern business establishment, it has always been more socially liberal and more pro-environment than the white working class. Now, in 1950, these were Rockefeller, Eisenhower Republicans. Now, they're Obama Democrats, a lot of them. But have their actual attitudes changed? This combination of, kind of economic conservatism and, being in favor of the environment, or have they simply moved from one party to another? Your emphasis is on a new elite, right? But aren't a lot of the attitudes you describe, this kind of economic conservatism and social liberalism, wasn't that a characteristic of the old waspy Protestant business class all along?
Well, there was definitely a lot of that. And my book does look at the historical antecedents at different places, and how, for example, on environmental issues, there was a lot of environmentalism among the upper class in earlier times. My editor kept going through and slashing out those historical sections, I'm sorry to say. But and so you do see some continuity. I cite a survey in the book of business leaders taken in 1971, which found that a majority of them supported the Nixon's Family Assistance Plan, which would be considered quite radical today, and that a majority of them also said that they subscribed to Keynesian economics, and also that survey broke down the political attitudes of different kinds of business leaders. and found that the ones who were from the Northeast, who had gone to elite institutions, Ivy League institutions, tended to be more liberal than the ones from the heartland and the ones from the South. And you see that same divide. What's different today is the sheer expansion of the amount of wealth in our society and the amount of people making a lot of money, and that has been due in part to tech, but also some other industries. I mean, it's just mind-boggling in many ways. You know, I cite in my book that there are 30,000 households in this nation with assets over $30 million. You know, that's a lot of super, super rich people. And that in particular, what's striking, and I devote a chapter to this, is the rise of wealth on the West Coast and in areas where previously there wasn't a tremendous amount of wealth. So today, there are many more billionaires in California than there are in New York. Many of the wealthiest counties in America are in California. King County, which covers Seattle, has more millionaires than Manhattan. And what you see is a lot of areas in the country that used to be dominated by kind of old economy money have seen an explosion of new economy money. The Pacific Northwest is a great example of that. You know, back in the early 1980s, when the Forbes 400 list was first out, there was exactly one person on the list who was from the Pacific Northwest. He was a timber baron from Washington. There's now a half a dozen people on the Forbes 400 list from the Pacific Northwest, all of whom made their money in tech. Similarly, you look at, you know, I have a section in my book on Texas, where there's been pretty significant changes in wealth. You know, it used to be that most of the rich people from Texas made their money in oil. Well, today the two richest people in Texas, one is one of the Walton heirs, but the other is Michael Dell. Finance and tech are now the biggest sources of jobs in both Dallas and Houston. So there's been a shift away from the old economy to the new economy in a lot of places, and that has changed the composition of who is in the upper class. I note, for example, that in George Bush's when George Bush left the White House, he moved to a suburb of Dallas called Preston Hollow, which is a very affluent place, the kind of place where, you know, big shot, rich conservatives have long lived. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I wonder what the campaign giving is of people in Preston Hollow. So I pulled George Bush's zip code up in Open Secrets. Turned out that Barack Obama raised more money in George Bush's new zip code in Preston Hollow than John McCain did. And I thought, well, now how could it be that a northern liberal from Chicago who is African American could raise more money in Preston Hollow than a decorated war veteran from the Southwest? And the answer, as I explain in the book, is that the people in Preston, the rich people who live in Preston Hollow have changed. There's sort of less of that old economy wealth and more lawyers in particular, but also some of these hedge fund people.
Well, we promised a conversation, so questions. Please identify yourself if you don't mind. Over here? Yes, down here.
Hi. What would you say to the idea that part of what might account for this is changes in the Democratic Party's economic philosophy, where it's become there's less there's a sharp divide between the parties. Even now, we're on Capitol Hill, it would sound like there's a lot of disagreement. We're arguing whether the top tax rate for millionaires should be 39% or 35%. So once you get that off the table, why wouldn't this sort of wealthy elite that's long been, or many of them have long been socially liberal, vote for the Democrats? They can sort of have their cake and eat it too now.
Yeah, I make the point in the book that there's there's no question that the Democratic Party is not the party of FDR, and there's no question that the sort of the debate over economic policy has generally shifted to the right in past couple decades. So I think that there's something there's a lot to your point, and I also make the point that the thing about these liberal rich people is pretty much they all embrace capitalism and markets, and they tend to be pretty uncritical of globalization. They tend to kind of have be tone deaf to the sort of losers in globalization. Most of these people have been the winners of globalization. They tend to be from the more affluent coastal areas and don't spend much time in the heartland parts of America, which have really been wiped out by free trade. They don't tend to be very enthusiastic about labor unions or regulation. So all of that I think is true, and those are points I make in the book. At the same time, I also try to sort of puzzle through the fact that in many ways the Democratic Party has shifted to the left since the Clinton era. If you look at the if you look at the analyses of roll call votes, if you look at the Americans for Democratic Action liberal quotient, the Americans for Democratic Action has been doing this compiling the liberal quotient for Democratic members of Congress for 50 years, I guess, and that liberal quotient was highest that it had ever been in 2007. And it had been, much higher in the last decade than it was in the 60s and 70s. The roll call data that Keith Poole and Rosenthal have put together shows sort of the Democratic Party moving to the left. The Democratic Party, of course, has lost a lot of those Southern moderates. And in particular, in the last 5 years or more, we saw top Democrats come out clearly in favor of raising taxes on the rich, and clearly in favor of universal health insurance during the Democratic primary in 2007, 2008. All the candidates said they would raise taxes on the rich. All the candidates came out specifically in favor of more than doubling taxes on hedge fund managers and private equity people. All the candidates came out in favor of universal health insurance. None of the candidates showed up at the DLC's convention in 2007. All of the candidates showed up at the Netroots convention. And so I think that so in many ways the party kind of moved to the left, and at the same time started pulling in a lot more money from affluent Americans, some of whom I think were quite alarmed by the Bush presidency, the extremism of the Republican Party, which is another explanation I get into in my book.
Yeah, talk a little bit about the degree to which that's driven as a kind of allergic reaction to the Christian right, which seems like a big part of the story. There's almost a kind of this sort of cultural ethos that is being that is driving a fair amount of this.
Yeah, no question about it, and I make the point that in many ways the Republican Party and upper class America are on two kind of opposite trajectories on a lot of issues. The Republican Party has become more religious, more based in rural and small town America, more xenophobic in many ways, and the upper class has become more based in metropolitan America and the coasts, more secular, more globally oriented, and more multicultural. And so it's sort of, what does Bill Gates have in common with Sarah Palin?
I think almost.
Not much. I mean, there's
The low taxes. Give them the low taxes.
low.
The commitment to low taxes and hating unions and being for free trade and a number of
Doesn't Bill Gates want
wanting to suck up the
restore the
high-tech
estate tax?
industry to let free immigration for so-called high-skilled workers. I mean, imagine there's a lot over that.
I mean, that would suggest that there is a kind of libertarian overlap. In other words, there's a libertarian right and libertarian left, and what you're describing sounds like there's a libertarian left that is the new wealth developed from both finance and especially high tech.
Yeah, there's definitely a libertarian left,
And
and
that's what you're describing.
So should your subtitle
well-
be the rise of the libertarian?
well, the rich, the Silicon Valley people long had a reputation of being libertarian, and there's a lot of libertarianism out there. A lot of these tech people do lean pretty libertarian. Pierre Omidyar, who started eBay, Jeff Bezos of Amazon, these are some libertarians. On the other hand, what you see, I think, as that industry has grown up, is that it has shed some of that libertarianism, and that more of these people are interested in government playing an active role. Bill Gates is, somebody who is, was the worst monopolist of the information age. Very much the John D. Rockefeller of his time. At the same time, he's somebody who has kind of consistently argued for a bigger government role in financing scientific research, who has fought and financed opposition to the right-wing ballot initiatives in the Pacific Northwest that would defund education with through the sort of the anti-tax measures, and Gates is now out calling for much bigger investments in green energy, new clean energy technology, and also calling for a carbon tax. So yes, Larry, I think that there are definitely some things that Sarah Palin and Bill Gates would find in common, but I would be astonished if Bill Gates ever voted for Sarah Palin if she won the nomination. And I do think that there is definitely a cultural thing there, no question about it, that there's just a discomfort with the religiosity, with the kind of glamorizing of Joe the plumber, and that rift is real.
Yes, I wondered, the liberal rich, do you think the conservative rich and liberal both support green energy equally, or is it more the liberal rich would favor moving into the green energy field?
Well,
It seems to be that way in Europe. I wondered how you look at it here, although it takes money to develop things.
Yeah, I mean the conservative rich seem to actually Boone Pickens, who famously had underwritten the Swift boat ads, has been out-toting his Pickens plan for clean energy. There's obviously a lot of self-interest there with his own investments, but in general, yeah, this clean energy technology has been something of much more interest to the liberal rich. And a lot of these people have scientific backgrounds. They are, the Google guys are an example. The whole high command of that organization, are basically scientists. They know climate change is real. They're not people who kind of just ignore glaring evidence like that. And I think, in fact, the climate change issue is a sort of another example of this divide. Another example of how the super educated, affluent types feel that the Republican Party is out of touch, because here they are denying the kind of overwhelming conclusion of scientists. Here they are showing no interest in the technologies of tomorrow that China is fast developing in other countries. So it's just one more thing that I think alienates them from today's GOP.
Llewellyn King with White House Chronicle Television. I was wondering to what extent the new wealth on both sides will change the nature of the self-finance candidate, introduce a new force, and will we end up with candidates self-financed, sort of buying their place in politics the way commissions were once bought in the military?
Well, there's a tremendous amount of that. The research on self-financed candidates since the early 1980s finds that of the super financiers, those who've spent several $1 million or more of their own money, vast majority of them have been Democrats. And I think that there's a reason for that, which is Democrats are interested in government and believe in public service. I mean, if you're a conservative and have a lot of money, why would you want to use that money to buy your way into politics? Certainly some of them have and some of them do. But it is statistically more common for wealthy Democrats to try to leverage their money into political office. And I look at a number of them, John Corzine being an example, who of course had been chairman of Goldman Sachs, and in 2005 was named the lifetime rating of the most liberal senator during his tenure there. And then went on to become a very progressive governor of New Jersey. Jared Polis, who represents Boulder, Colorado, I also look at. I do say that this is, throughout the book, I talk about how the sort of ironic threat that the liberal rich pose to democracy, because these are people who, they have a sort of do-gooding aspiration, and they use their money and their influence to kind of push their way into the civic sphere and muscle aside other people who deserve to have positions of leadership more in that sphere. I mean, John Corzine took out James Florio in a primary in New Jersey when he ran for Senate, spending millions of dollars to just knock Florio, who was a very committed progressive public servant, out of the race. And this is Florio deserved to have that comeback. He lost his career because he raised taxes. He deserved to have that second chance, blown out of the money by blown out of the race by Corzine's money. Jared Polis in Colorado took out one of the top leading women Democrats in that state who deserved that congressional seat more, in my view. And so I think it's very disturbing, and that's a recurrent theme throughout the book, is the way in which this money subverts democracy and civil society.
As a sort of follow-up, you mentioned the new think tanks, the new liberal think tanks, which may include this one. Are they having a political effect, the way that the right-wing think tanks have been very effective in Republican administrations?
Well, that's hard, I guess, maybe hard to gauge. It's too early on. If you look back at the kind of conservative think tank movement, I mean, that took decades to sort of develop, and we all know how effective that's been. I would say that they certainly have had some effect, but I think that there's a critique of the new think tanks, not to name any names, but in terms of how
go on.
how willing they are to sort of really challenge the economic structures of our society. And and that's a point I make throughout the book, is that a lot of this putatively liberal money and these people, they aren't necessarily interested in fundamentally challenging the distribution of wealth and power in this country. They're interested in sort of incremental change, I would say. But incremental change can be significant.
I was wondering, when you stated FDR, and at that time, the whole U.S. government was guided by people from Hampton and Newport, Maine, Boston, New York. And that was the governing body here in the United States. It has changed drastically since then, and there's been a social capital coming in to a great degree. And that social capital is largely all over the country. New York has lost its dominance as the fount of money as such, and you apparently think money is the guiding force in politics. It probably is. And these people, 30,000 people with $30 million each, are probably the most powerful in the country. But there are other social elements in the country which may not have that much wealth, but which are fairly comfortably off and can exert influence. And those that come now from such places as the Silicon Valley and the Seattle lumber merchants, as well as the Midwest grain merchants and chemical factories and other things like that. And they are a growing influence on the United States populace. The only thing is that they are not poor people.
Can I interrupt you right there, just so I
So therefore, the governing body still is in the wealthy hand, but it is atomized.
It's totally atomized, and not totally, but it is quite atomized. And it's striking just how many centers of economic power there are in this country. You know, there is the Silicon Valley, which has grown much larger and more wealthy. The power in Southern California around the entertainment industry is phenomenal. I look in my book at how globalization has just sort of put the entertainment industry on steroids, and there's so much more wealth, in Hollywood and the entertainment industry than there was in earlier times. And then the financial wealth is not just in New York, but in other places. And then there's a lot of those sort of more traditional heartland industries or old economy industries, which are still around and still very powerful. I mean, ExxonMobil is the second largest corporation in the country, and one of the biggest spenders on lobbying in
I was wondering about in Europe, for example, if you're a count or a baron or something like that, and you're a playboy, that's respected. That playboy still can go around the bar and still be a respected man. But in the United States, that's not true. Rockefeller had to become a governor before he became a respected person. So therefore, there is still in the United States the amount of respect a person gets is through his accomplishments as such, which I think is very good. But can that continue? I'm not sure of that. And whether that would be a good idea to continue that philosophy.
Well, if somebody can become president without even completing a full term of their first Senate term, I think that...
Yeah, that's right, exactly.
My name is Samar Chatterjee from Safe Foundation. Now, I gather that from your introduction that you are a conservative writing about the rise of liberal wealthy. That's not okay. Then you can correct me. But let me say this: that I would not have. I mean, I came first to this country in 1970, and I went to the university. And most professors in those universities in those days were liberals, and that is the reason I like this country. But when I came out of the university and I saw the rest of the population, I was not very thrilled, to be honest. Particularly the blue-collar right wing, that did not very impress me because there are mean people in every country. So I guess they have their place. So now, having said that. I still don't know. You haven't given us the statistics to whether the liberal rich have more money than the right-wing, I like to call them fascist in the parenthesis, the right-wing the rich has more money because George Bush and Dick Cheney collected a lot of money. I was really amazed the way they collected the money. But then when... let me frame the question. But then came Barack Obama. He collected a lot of money. So that means there is a lot of middle ground rich in this country who swing both ways. And thanks God that happens. Otherwise, we would have a fascist government in this country all the time. Yeah. And that wouldn't be very good, internationally at least. So go ahead.
Yep. Well, it's hard to know who has more money, but I do point out that as we have shifted from this manufacturing to a knowledge economy, the composition of the rich have changed. And so if you look at the Forbes 400, back in the 1980s, it was dominated by oil money, manufacturing money. When the list was first published, the number one richest guy was a shipping magnate, and now the list is much more dominated by tech and finance. And that year after year, the amount of the number of rich people on the list who come from the old economy has gone down. One of the rich oil guys, Dan Duncan, who was on the list, one of the richest oil people in America, died this year, conveniently when the estate tax had lapsed. There's not a lot of oil billionaires replacing him. In contrast, Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook, just came on the list, and when that company goes public, there'll probably be a couple other Facebook billionaires on the list. So the kind of trend is clear, which is where the wealth is going to. In terms of specifically the money in politics, what we've seen is a number of very wealthy donors on the Democratic side pumping a huge amount of money into our politics. And I look at the 2004 campaign, which was sort of the most dramatic example of this. George Soros himself gave $23 million to 527s. Peter Lewis gave the same amount. The Sandlers gave $13 million. Stephen Bing, 4 people gave $75 million to liberal 527s in the 2004 campaign. In 2008, Soros put in $5 million. Stephen Bing put in almost $5 million. Those are the two biggest backers of the Obama push. A lot is made about the Team Obama like to talk about all their small donors, but when you actually finish tallying up the numbers and you looked at the money raised for the inauguration and the money raised for the Democratic National Convention, it turned out that Barack Obama didn't raise any more money from small donors than George Bush did in 2004. Barack Obama's candidacy was made possible in large part by his early success in the money primaries and a few very wealthy people who came in. Steven Spielberg, David Geffen threw him that big fundraiser in Hollywood. He racked up some early bundlers in the New York Finance Committee. That's how that guy got started in terms of really being a big league competitor. And Barack Obama writes in his memoirs about the kind of corrupting effect of that money. I have a great quote in my book in which he says, when you spend all your time around rich people and hedge fund people who generally are centrist on economic policy and are, as I said, are tone deaf to the negative effects of globalization, don't care much for unions, and think that all we have to do is give everybody a better education, it starts to wear off on you. And Obama wrote those words before he started really raising the big money for his presidential campaign. So I think that there's no on the one hand, isn't it great that the playing field has been kind of leveled and all this new Democratic money has stepped up to the plate. On the other hand, it is still money in politics and it still has a corrosive effect.
Yes, right here.
Yes, my name's Ed Connors and I'm with the American Prospect, and I work on the business side there, managing the advertising for the website and magazine, so I'm unabashedly looking for some of that money from the new progressive infrastructure that you described. But I'm really interested just in a conversational way about the opposition to unions among this new liberal upper class. Can you flesh out some of that opposition, the reasons for it? I didn't read your book yet, but perhaps there's some anecdotal background that you could give about that opposition. And doesn't it almost foster a sense that nobody's looking out for the little guy that has generally been the position that the Democratic Party, the Progressive Party, has taken?
You know, in I think it was March 2009, Warren Buffett was asked about you know, how he felt about the Employee Free Choice Act, and said that he opposed it. You know, Warren Buffett, who had been a big supporter of Obama, and you know, it in many ways might fit the profile of one of these liberal rich people, and you know, I don't know specifically what Buffett's thinking is, except for the fact that he has a personal economic interest in stopping unions from forming in the companies that he runs, you know, as part of Berkshire Hathaway. So, you know, I think that there's a real a lot of these people, when push comes to shove on their own financial interests, you know, they're liberal except when it comes to their own financial interests. What struck me more, though, in regard to the union question, is how unions really weren't much on these people's radar. You know, I've read a lot about these sort of tech companies, and you know, just finished reading a history of Facebook, and you know, read a history of Google, and read a history of eBay, and you know, a lot of these companies are built by through recruiting, you know, very educated professionals, and it's a very different context than, say, a retail situation like Walmart. And I think that's one of the differences of this sort of this new money and the old money is you know, you know, it used to be that if you were somebody high up in the corporate world, you were probably involved in an industrial firm that had workers who were, you know, or unions, or you were in battles with unions, and you know, you probably lived in the suburbs and you were Republican. And now a lot of these people high up, you know, they're in very different kinds of companies and are not in that kind of class warfare in the same way, which is not to say that there's not, you know, more subtle forms of class warfare going on in those companies. I mean, you know, just as anybody who's tried to organize janitors in Silicon Valley, you know, or the big janitorial organizing fights in Los Angeles, you know, with a lot of these entertainment companies or hotels, and so these class divisions remain as real as ever, except that they're not playing out in sort of the immediate sphere in the same way of this for these you know, new economy rich people.
What's happening in the economy is that Clinton's and Tony Blair turned political power into cash. And I read in French news yesterday, Carla Bruni, Sarkozy, Michelle Obama, and Obama are pretty impressed by how much money Tony Blair made. So they want to be one-term presidents and cash in before it's too late. But I think that what Marx is finally proved right, that, you know, capitalism is going to destroy itself. So these people are rushing in before it's too late for them. I'm pretty disgusted that people are. Even if it's not true or not, just the fact that these rumors are causing a circulation.
It's about 10 till. We're going to spend about 10 more minutes before we can get to some refreshments. We'll have a lightning round of questions, so we'll have several questions in a row, if you don't mind. You know, maybe 2 or 3, and then David can answer, and we'll wrap up. Yes, the back row.
I'm Michael Lipsky. I work with Denise and with David. And David, so I think the normative thrust of the book is that now that liberals have a lot of money, what do Democrats think about some of their standard views of the role of money in society? And you pointed out that rich liberals still have money in society, and that's a challenge to people interested in campaign finance reform. Another area of interest is the role of money in shaping public policy through such things as pouring a huge amount of money into certain kinds of schools and school reform and so on. Does your book speak to that, or would you speak to that?
Okay, we'll take that if you can remember it. Another question from Larry.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's very interesting. Look forward to digging into it. I might disagree about the idea of posing liberal rich people versus conservative blue collar people. It really depends on what we're talking about, economic issues or So, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, people might have said, well, the Democratic Party needs to get rid of all the Southern conservatives so they can have a real party. And now we kind of did that, and now there's another kind of division. Then what do you think for those like me and imagine you who identify with a progressive economic class-based agenda? What are the prospects? What does all this mean for how we approach politics? And how much of this kind of division you're talking about leads to the kind of muddled policy formulation of the Obama administration?
Okay, two questions. That's probably enough to remember. And they sort of overlap. So.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so just to take up the second one, yeah, we did get rid of all the Southern Democrats, and now we have all the affluent, more economically centrist Democrats. And I think that the Democratic Party has a real challenge in that regard. But before I say more, one of the points I make in my book is, I go back and I look at the battles in the first Obama year, around the stimulus, around healthcare, around financial reform, and I note that, and I look at the Democrats who voted for those reforms, and the Democrats in Congress who voted against them, and in nearly all cases, the Democrats who voted against the more progressive reforms that came up to Congress were representing more downscale white districts. And the Democrats who voted for those reforms were representing more affluent parts of America. And this will play out in the debate over the Bush tax cuts. I guarantee you that the Democrats who vote against repealing those tax cuts for the wealthy are not going to be the Democrats who represent wealthy people. They're going to be the Democrats who represent downscale white voters. So I think we have a real problem in the class division at the.
Joe Lieberman and Jared Polis are both on the side of that.
Well, there are. Well, I mean.
In defense of the downscale white Democrats, the New Deal model was one with a fairly egalitarian pre-tax structure, so that there was actually very little redistribution. We've now moved to a model where economic progressivism is designed as taxing the rich who get no benefits, and then having massive subsidies that are means tested for poor people, particularly, who pay no taxes or pay, reduced taxes. So it's not inconsistent, for FDR Democrats to say, well, wait a second, that's not the model. I mean, the classic model of social insurance was everybody pays the payroll tax and everybody, gets the benefits. So I just think this is part of, I'm strengthening your argument. I think that as the income distribution has gotten more and more polarized, even the economic progressives have redefined themselves as, tax the rich and pay for the poor and kind of neglect the middle, which was not the original New Deal model.
Mm-hmm.
It's more redistributionist than the New Deal was.
Just to make one other, share one other fact that I cite in the book is, so there's some interesting analysis of where all the wealthy taxpayers live in America, what congressional districts, broken down, which members of Congress have the most wealthy taxpayers, and also the Heritage Foundation did a study of which congressional districts would face the biggest new tax burdens under the Obama tax plan in 2008, and the people who are getting slammed the most, not surprisingly, by any new taxes on the rich, turn out to live in the districts of Carolyn Maloney, Henry Waxman, Anna Eshoo, Chris Van Hollen, Nancy Pelosi. So I went back. I went through and looked at this, and all of the turns out that the members of Congress who represent the most rich people, who will pay the most new taxes under Obama's tax plans, all have all get 100% ratings from progressive groups on these tax issues, and all get F ratings from, or 0 ratings from some of these conservative groups, and I find that interesting, and it says to me that that in many ways I mean, we kind of face two obstacles. One is the power of corporations and all the money that is used to subvert and stop and or repeal reforms for that will benefit ordinary Americans. And the other obstacle is working class white voters who distrust government, don't want taxes of any kind. And so I make the point that we kind of have challenges on both sides there. And I suggest, just to try to answer your question, it's very hard to for the Democrats to square the circle on economic policy, because it's hard to be populist. I mean, we can have a debate all we want about, well, maybe we should kick the rich people out of the affluent people out of the Democratic Party, but in a way, it's too late for that. Their votes and their money are too important, and that presents a real serious challenge. I do suggest that there are certain kinds of investments that I think that these affluent, more liberal-minded people will go for. I think that investments in infrastructure, investments in scientific research, investments in public in education from pre-K through more spending on higher education. I also think that a lot of these people would go for efforts to buffer workers from the worst downsides of globalization, more investments in transition aid and job training and that kind of stuff. We can debate whether that stuff is really that effective, but I think that these people, a lot of these wealthy people, are okay with some level of redistribution via fiscal policy by increasing taxes on the rich and increasing subsidies through the earned income tax credit or whatever for the poor. I mean, certainly that's one of the good things that Clinton did, is raise taxes on the rich and dramatically increase the earned income tax credit. And there was not a lot of pushback from his wealthy supporters on that. So I think that there are certain things we can do. Right. The Walmart loves the EITC.
No, seriously. If you look at where the rich live, they are in these extremely densely populated cities. The middle class has moved out. It's New York, San Francisco, Washington. The labor market at the low end is flooded by mass immigration, mass unskilled immigration, since we don't, unlike Canada and Britain and so on, we don't have a skilled immigration system. So that wipes out the unions, the service sector workers in the cities, and it keeps wages down. So if I'm a rich liberal Democrat in New York, then basically I have a buyer's market in the working poor as my servants, the nanny and the cook and the chef and all of that. And, the EITC was a conservative policy. It was Reagan's favorite policy because it is a subsidy to the consumer of cheap labor, right? Now, the living wage, if you said, okay, the people in Palo Alto have to pay $12 an hour, for their janitors and their cooks and so on, that would, be an economic progressive policy, in my opinion. But I don't think the EITC is a progressive policy. I think it was a right-wing Republican policy in the 1970s. And the fact that this is now considered a liberal policy rather than a cheap labor subsidy just shows how much under Clintonism, this kind of Reagan, Jerry Ford sort of thing has changed. I really think that the problem that the Democrats have with the suburban, exurban working class is that they live in a separate America from urban America, right? There are very few rich people and there are very few working poor in their suburbs and exurbs and small towns, right? And so, if the federal government is taxing everybody and then paying chiefly for, the means-tested poor, because remember, the white working class, or the brown working class for that matter, or black, is not getting the EITC. They make too much money, right? You know, so essentially this is you're taxing everybody to pay for the servants of the rich, since the working poor are disproportionately, directly or indirectly.
Well, the people who work in Walmart who need to collect the EITC and Medicaid are not necessarily the servants of the rich.
Yeah, but the working poor are concentrated in metro areas, where the middle class, they're too expensive for the middle
Right.
class.
But the working poor work in all sorts of different.
That's a false syllogism.
The working poor don't just work as janitors for Goldman Sachs. I mean, they're working at we're working at Walmart. They're working at gas stations. They're working.
Okay, but my point is simply that why would you not want a living wage rather than the EITC? Because the EITC socializes the cost.
Oh yeah, there's no.
Of paying people starvation wages.
There's no question.
Whereas the living wage forces the consumer to pay the cost.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that. I mean, we had a fellow who was looking at corporate support for not just the EITC, but children's health insurance, Medicaid, other kinds of things that in effect allow their low-wage workers, to survive and keep down demands for higher wages. I think you're absolutely right on that, Michael. To come back to your point, the one of the really disturbing things that some of these do-good or rich people are doing is just pouring a huge amount of money into certain policy areas that give them enormous influence over those policy areas. Bill Gates in 2006, in a survey of educators, was picked as the #1 most influential person in public education. Well, and that was largely based upon the fact that he'd spent $2 billion trying to create all these small public schools and reform the small high schools and reform the education system around the concept of small high schools. Well, now, I mean, nobody elected Bill Gates to anything. This guy, until recently, was known just for having a monopolistic software company, and I think it's the education sector is long seen as one of the more democratic spheres of American life. And we have not only Gates, but Eli Broad has also spent a huge amount of money pushing charter schools. Gates himself acknowledged that all that $2 billion was largely wasted on that small high school idea because it turned out to not really work very well. Meanwhile, all that money turned a lot of public school systems upside down. The research on charter schools, which Eli Broad has been deeply behind, shows that they don't necessarily yield better results, and even some charter school advocates have begun sort of pulling away from that. So I think that all that is very disturbing. And then in the international arena, there's lots of questions about the Gates money and its huge footprint. So again, what?
There's something on this in the book that, like Democrats for Education Reform, Bill Gates and Broad.
Yeah. That's in the book. I had a lot more on education, but ended up cutting out. But that's an example of sort of the double-edged sword here. On the one hand, it's good that Bill Gates and Eli Broad didn't decide to put all their money into private vouchers, right? The Walmart people and some other conservative billionaires, the Amway money has gone to private vouchers. There's a number of very wealthy people who've spent tens of millions of dollars to bring private vouchers into the mainstream. Thank goodness that Gates and Broad didn't get on that bandwagon, because I think that would have had a very powerful effect and would have really moved education debate further to the right. On the other hand, the stuff they're doing is, not stuff I would do, and a lot of educators would do, and so that's disturbing. On the one hand, they're defending the public education system. On the other hand, they're introducing reforms which are questionable.
Would you like to follow up with that?
I think that's a great answer. I would just point out that American Democrats have had this debate all of this past century, but it's more interesting now because, as David is pointing out, the people who are pouring all this money in are not as polarizing figures as in the past. But the foundation world of philanthropy has always been subject, in this tension, with Democrats who wondered why the big philanthropists like Vanderbilt and others were setting the policy agenda.
Well, the book is Fortunes of Change, The Rise of the Liberal Rich and the Remaking of America, a great example of what Kevin Phillips calls plutocracy. I think that's his genre. Copies are for sale outside, and we invite you to continue the conversation with David, with his permission, while we break for refreshments. Thank you for coming. And please join
Thank you.
me in thanking David.